sector was all but doomed. The hive ships of the Tyranids hung over each world, seeding them with obscene creatures. The Tyranids were ready to feast. But these worlds are also the recruiting ground for the Blood Ravens, a chapter of the Emperor's own Space Marines, and they refused to yield. The veteran Tarkus weathered pitiless alien attacks, allowing Cyrus and his scouts to find weaknesses in our ravenous foes, while Avitus leveled his righteous fury in their casinos. Thaddeus descended upon them on wings of fire, and Davian Fool, the first to fall against the Tyranids, returned from death in the form of a mighty dreadnought. You led them all, Commander. Together, you fought across the deserts of Calderis, through the jungles of Typhon, and beneath the great spire cities of Meridian. You faced an implacable enemy, and you triumphed. But there is a truth more implacable than any tyranny. A new threat will always emerge. Once, Planet Aurelia was the sector's crown jewel, home to billions of souls. Then came the warp storms. They pushed Aurelia into a new orbit, encased the planet in ice, and swallowed it whole. For 1,000 years, the warp held Aurelia in its terrible grip, depositing untold horrors across its surface. Now, planet Aurelia has returned. It should be a barren ball of ice, but a signal is coming from its surface. A blood raven signal. A call for help.
Hey good people, it's the 8-Bit Academic here with another episode of Warhammer 40K. I swear this is the only other Warhammer centric video I'm making. I promise. I can quit anytime, really. Anyway, as you can see, I'm once again showcasing Warhammer 40K, Dawn of War 2, because it currently is the only Warhammer game my broadcast can afford. Just a quick disclaimer, if my voice is sounding a little bit raspy, it's because I came down with a little bad case of the flu, and I'm still currently recovering. So I do apologize in advance for anyone that's watching or listening to this video for the way my voice sounds. But even in times of sickness and in poor health, we still have to please the algorithm gods of YouTube. So without further ado, let's continue.
We homeboys, right? Fucking man, these loose rules, vato. Gracias, okay?
Simón. You white bitch, give me some chon-chon.
Stay away from me.
Get nothing for free in here, punk.
Chinga tu madre! Okay.
If you haven't seen my previous video about Warhammer 40K and how awesome it is, please go check it out now by following the link in the description box down below. Anyone who doesn't is a nerdling and should definitely be purged by the Black Templars. Anyway, today's video isn't really so much about Warhammer 40K itself, but the sci-fi and fantasy genre it inspired, which is called Grimdark. The term itself being taken from Warhammer 40K's tagline, "In the grim darkness of the future, there is only war," as well as being built upon elements of the 40K setting, one in which the future is bleak, oppressive, hopelessness, and basically an all-out shitfest, where there are no heroes and no lasting victories or peace. As I discussed in my previous 40K video, much of the grimdark of the 40K setting was inspired by many terrible and tragic events that took place during the 20th century, from the 2 world wars the various totalitarian dictatorships that popped up, numerous civil wars in various countries, and the overall paranoia of the Cold War, and the possibility of it turning into an extremely undesirable situation of humanity going boom. Even though in more modern times it feels like we're edging closer and closer to our own big kaboom and our own lovely little grimdark setting thanks to current geopolitics. Start collecting those bottle caps, people.
Hey friend, listen. I know the world is scary right now, but it's gonna get way worse.
As much as the original creators of 40K are cited as being the pioneers of the grimdark genre, I have second thoughts as to whether they actually considered their own creation grimdark, or let alone could predict that they had set in motion the inspiration for an entire new genre of speculative fiction, which would go on to spawn multiple other works that take place in such bleak and hopeless settings. And even though Games Workshop are credited as being the granddaddies of grimdark, one could also look at other works that predate Warhammer 40K to see examples of what today could be considered grimdark, or at least setting the foundations upon which grimdark would be built, such as those of H.P. Lovecraft or even George Orwell's 1984, as well as Harlan Ellison's I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, which I have read, and boy, that story was bleak. Essentially, a grimdark world could be summed up as one in which its inhabitants have lost the ability to have hope. While they may have hope in themselves or their heroes, and maybe even have moments of respite or relief from their troubles and the overall absolute shittiness of their never-ending situations, they do not see nor do they believe in a possibility of a future where things get better or improve. Jeez, sounds kinda like me. Maybe that's why I like 40K so much. Anyway, grimdark settings are usually ones where the overall mindset isn't to fight for a brighter future, but to rather make things slightly more tolerable and to delay the inevitable end as much as possible, to rage against the dying of the light, or to not go gently into that good night, which in my opinion is kinda badass. Over the course of literary history, there have been at least several attempts at trying to define what grimdark actually is. British science fiction and fantasy author Adam Roberts described it as fiction where nobody is honorable and might is right, and as the standard way of referring to fantasies that turn their backs on the more uplifting visions of idealized medieval fantasy, and instead stress how nasty, brutish, short and bleak life back then really was. But he also noted that grimdark has little to do with reimagining an actual historical reality, and more with conveying the sense that our own world is a cynical, disillusioned, ultra-violent place. Genevieve Valentine, an American science fiction and fantasy writer, called grimdark a shorthand for a subgenre of fantasy fiction that claims to trade on the psychology of those sword-toting heroes and the dark realism behind all those kingdom politics. In the view of Jared Shurin, grimdark fantasy has three key components: a grim and dark tone,
You don't say!
a sense of realism, for example monarchs that are incompetent and heroes that are deeply flawed and sometimes even morally ambiguous, and the agency of the protagonists, whereas in high fantasy everything is predestined and the tension revolves around how the heroes defeat the evil overlord and clear distinctions between morality and immorality. Grimdark is fantasy Protestantism or fantasy rebellion. Characters have to choose between good and evil and sometimes even fail at making the right choices, as well as being just as lost as we are in the real world. Liz Bourke.
Listen properly.
Liz Bourke considered grimdark's defining characteristic to be a retreat into the valorization of darkness for darkness's sake, into a kind of nihilism that portrays right action as either being impossible or futile. This, according to her, has the effect of absolving the protagonist as well as the reader from moral responsibility. Helen Young equates Grimdark to gritty fantasy, as exemplified by George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire series, or better known by its TV adaptation, Game of Thrones. As with all things, however, there has been debate as to whether Grimdark is a genre in its own right or an unhelpful and derogatory label. Genevieve Valentine has also noted that while some writers have embraced the term, others see it as a dismissive term for fantasy that deliberately dismantles traditional and pre-existing tropes within the genre, a stamp which many believe is unfairly applied. According to the aforementioned British author Adam Roberts, Grimdark is an anti-Tolkien approach to fantasy writing. George R.R. Martin's popular fantasy series, A Song of Ice and Fire, is characterized, in Roberts' view, by its reaction to Tolkien's idealism, even though it owes much of its initial inspiration to Tolkien and definitely contains elements that could be considered grimdark. Some influential figures in the sci-fi and fantasy genre, like John Garrard, drew a connection between grimdark and the goth subculture and movement of the late 1980s and 1990s, and its general cynicism and overall advocacy for all things gloomy, dark, bleak and negative, as well as a focus on the idea of loss and all things relating to it. Many authors since the 1980s have been considered to have produced works that include elements of grimdark fantasy. These include Glenn Cook, George R.R. Martin, Joe Abercrombie, Richard K. Morgan, Paul Kearney, Mark Lawrence, and Anna Smith Park. In the world of Japanese manga, one could even consider Kentaro Miura's Berserk to have a few elements of grimdark as well. However, this is obviously contrasted and even challenged by the fact that there are many moments of victory and hope, as well as a genuine striving for said hope and a continuous struggle against the overall bleakness and nihilism of the dark world which the various characters inhabit. A few other examples within anime I could think of that come very close to the nihilistic, bleak and violent hopelessness of the grimdark genre would be the works of Go Nagai, especially Devilman and Violence Jack, or Tony Takazaki's cyberpunk horror manga titled Genocyber, which was also made into a 5-part OVA series in 1994, which was one of, if not the most disturbing and violent anime I had ever watched, and left me questioning my existence and why I would subject myself to such man-made horrors beyond my comprehension for quite some time afterwards. It's still pretty freaking awesome though, go and watch it. In terms of sci-fi, grimdark stories often tend to take place in dystopian settings, but ones where the good guys never win, or where there are no good guys to begin with, but rather individuals simply trying to survive and delay their inevitable demise by balancing between the lines of morality and immorality, or good and evil. A very good example of a possible precursor to the grimdark to the grimdark subgenre in fiction is George Orwell's 1984, which today is definitely regarded as such by many. It features a story set in a totalitarian surveillance state, not too different from real-life examples like North Korea or the former Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, in which any and all hope of change and a brighter future are efficiently and effectively stamped out or crushed by the regime, as is evidenced in one of the most famous quotes in the book and its film adaptation. If you want a vision of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever.
There is no loyalty except loyalty to the party. There is no love except love of Big Brother. All competing pleasures. they will destroy. If you want a vision of the future, Winston, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever.
Definitely not the type of future that I would like to live in. Let's hope it doesn't come true. However, with all this being said and my tricky attempt at trying to define what Grimdark is, in reality the definition of it is still being hotly debated by both fiction authors and fans alike to this very day, even down to arguing about which fictional works could be considered to fit neatly into its category of sci-fi and fantasy. I personally think the only form of fictional universe that could be fully considered Grimdark is the one that inspired its label in the first place, and that is Warhammer 40K, because I am loyal to my emperor. A really funny comment I found on Quora whilst researching this topic is quoted as saying, "Grimdark is something so dark, so depressing, so exaggerated that it circles back around into being comical. The good guys are just the least evil bad guys. The choices are often between genocide and genocide with party hats, and there are skulls just everywhere. Armor, walls, murals, and piled high to the sky." All credit goes to the original commenter James Eisner. And James, if you ever see this video, I think you summed it up very beautifully. Anyway, that's it from me for today. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and perhaps let's start a nerd rage-filled argument in the comments about what is and isn't Grimdark, and perhaps bounce a few recommendations and examples back and forth of what you might consider to fit into the subgenre of fantasy and sci-fi fiction. All for the algorithm, of course. Until next time, folks, see ya. So, I literally only found out about these other pieces of media that could fall under the Grimdark category only recently, hence why I decided to add it in at the end of the video as sort of a little bonus fact. Think of it as a Marvel end credit scene. The first in this list of media that may be categorized as Grimdark, or at least contain certain elements of such, would be literally all the recent popular video games by Japanese game developer From Software, most notably the Soulsborne Games, as well as some of their clones that are created by other developers like Bleak Faith. It's pretty weird how I never stopped to think that some of these games could fall under the category of Grimdark, or at least be thought of as containing some elements of Grimdark, since most people regard them simply as dark fantasy. Upon closer inspection, however, of just how bleak and hopeless the settings of each game is, one could definitely get the sense that they would fit comfortably within the subgenre of Grimdark. Take the Dark Souls games for example. All of them are set in a dark and bleak medieval fantasy world and center around a once great kingdom or empire that conquered its realm and defeated its enemies, namely the everlasting dragons, who had once ruled the world but were driven to near extinction by the god king Gwyn and his allies, who then established a long-lasting age of prosperity, until finally civil war, infighting, greed, corruption, decay, incompetence, and in air quotes, disease, like the undead curse, had begun to set in, causing said empire to begin to crumble from within, and thus requiring a chosen undead warrior to continuously link the first flame, to extend the cycle of the Age of Light and desperately stave off the Age of Darkness, which by the third game one can see is ultimately pointless, if one gets the ending where your player character links the first flame once again, only this time the flame is but a mere flicker in the midst of the ever-encroaching darkness, proving that in the universe of Dark Souls, the world cycles through ages of light and dark for eternity, and that no matter how mortals may try, they ultimately have no control over the cycle, and attempts at exceeding the Age of Light will only lead to the inevitable Age of Dark anyway. Unless you were one of those assholes who just went for that Age of Dark ending from the get-go and acted like a total dick towards all friendly NPCs who were trying to help you. You monster. A similar trend of themes can be seen in their other games as well, like that of Sekiro, Bloodborne, and Elden Ring. but if you want to know more about the lore behind those games, I suggest watching some of the videos of Vaatividya or the Tarnished Archeologist. They do some really great in-depth analyses and deep dives into everything related to these games. One last piece of Grimdark media I would like to mention is that of the recently released Trench Crusade tabletop wargame, which seems like it may even come to rival not only the gaming aspect but also the grimdarkness of Warhammer 40K and Warhammer Fantasy, which over the years seem to have started to fall into a state of grimderp rather than grimdark, due to lore writers at Black Library pushing the whole grimdark theme so hard that it ends up becoming too ridiculous to the point of parodying itself and becoming too exaggerated for its own good. Trench Crusade is set in an alternate history of Earth, where the Catholic Church is waging a never-ending war for the past 800 plus years against the continuous onslaught from the hordes of Hell and Satan himself. During the time of the Christian Crusades into Jerusalem against the Muslim Saracen kingdoms in the medieval period, the Knights Templar engaged in extremely heretical practices and dark magic that opened an interdimensional gateway to hell, allowing hordes of demons and fallen angels to begin ravaging the earth. Fast forward to the early 1900s, during the time of the First World War, and humanity under the leadership of the all-powerful Church and the Vatican have been locked in a brutal ongoing conflict in an attempt to keep the demonic forces at bay and prevent them from overrunning the earth, while simultaneously also fighting against other factions for control of the Holy Land, such as heretic forces who sold their souls and now side with Hell, and the Iron Sultanate, which is basically the Muslim Ottoman Empire on steroids. Lastly, in terms of grimdark sci-fi, other than the ones I had already mentioned in this video, I would like to put forward my own little suggestion, which may or may not get completely shot down by fans of the subgenre, and that would be a few of the works of Tsutomu Nihei, who most people will know as the creator of the dark cyberpunk manga series Blam, or Blam, or Blame, or Buramu, whatever. Being a massive fan of his work and having read everything he has made except for his latest manga titled Tower Dungeon, I would like to think that some of his works, especially Blam, as well as Biomega and Abara, may contain certain elements of what could be considered grimdark, with how bleak and depressing the overall settings of each universe is. However, I am self-aware enough to also disagree with myself in realizing that maybe this is all just wishful thinking on my part, and that they mostly simply fall under dark sci-fi, with Blam being more of a dark cyberpunk setting. I've also seen online discussions that consider the Diablo games, at least the first two, as being grimdark, but at this point, maybe the label is just being thrown around for the sake of it. Perhaps grimdark shouldn't have been thought of a genre at all, since even the intellectual property that it gets its namesake and themes from isn't always as super bleak and horrible as it attempts to make itself out to be, since as I had mentioned earlier, it ends up coming off as just ridiculous and trying too hard. Maybe we should just go back to calling things dark fantasy and dark sci-fi, and leave the word grimdark as just being part of the promotional tagline for Warhammer 40K. Because in researching this video, I mostly came across arguments and debates about what should and shouldn't be considered grimdark, and roundabout answers by famous authors who are just as confused as everyone else. Anyway, that's all I got for today. Go away now. Just kidding. See you all in the next one, and yes, this really is the end for now. So bye.
¡Qué verga! ¡Vamos a la reina! ¿Qué está pasando? ¡Fue conmigo! ¿Qué está pasando? ¡Qué verga! ¡Ah! ¡Oh, pues mató! Maro bosan. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim.